In this chapter, we'll learn how to create sessions, add tracks, and we'll look at the main Pro Tools windows. Now that we've launched Pro Tools, the first thing we need to do is create a new session. A session is at the heart of things in Pro Tools, whether we're creating a simple sound effect or a feature film soundtrack. Let's go to the File menu now and choose New Session. This brings up the New Session dialog. The default settings work well here, but let's discuss the two most important parameters. Bit depth and sample rate have a lot to do with our overall audio quality. 24-bit recording provides much more dynamic range than 16-bit recording, and it sounds noticeably better. Even if we create a 16-bit CD later, we'll still benefit by tracking and mixing at 24 bits. Next, we'll move on to sample rate. When we convert analog signals to digital, we sample them. The sample rate refers to how many times we sample the audio each second. One thing we want to consider here is our final output. CDs use 44.1, while broadcast video and DVD typically use 48. Higher sample rates and bit depths result in better audio quality, but they also require more hard drive space and computer power. There's a lot of pros using 24-bit and 44.1 for most of their sessions. If you have high sample rates available, by all means, experiment. On this DVD, we'll be using 24-bit and 44.1 as our settings. Let's name our session. I'll type in Pro Tools Basics. Now we need to decide where to create the session. Here's an important decision, because this will determine where our audio gets recorded. A dedicated hard drive for audio is definitely the way to go. You'll get better performance and eliminate a host of potential problems. If you don't have one, use your system drive to get started, but plan on getting a dedicated hard drive for audio right away. There's a list of approved drives at digidesign.com. We'll navigate to the hard drive named Audio, click to make sure it's selected, and click on Save to create our session. When you create a new session, Pro Tools creates a new folder on your hard drive with the session document and folders for audio files and fade files. Now that we have a session, our next step is to create some new tracks. Let's go to the Track menu and choose New. Pro Tools offers 5 different track types: Audio, Auxiliary, Master Fader, MIDI, and Instrument. For now, let's just create 4 mono audio tracks. I'll just type 4 and click on Create. Most of our work in Pro Tools takes place in 2 windows, the Edit window and the Mix window. We can show or hide any of our main windows by clicking on the Windows menu and choosing the appropriate option. Since we use the Edit window and the Mix window a lot, let's learn our first keyboard shortcut. We can switch between the Mix and Edit windows by using Control and equal on the PC or Command and equal on the Macintosh. Pro Tools menus list the keyboard shortcuts just to the right of the menu item. You can refer to the complete list by choosing Keyboard Shortcuts from the Help menu. Let's show the Edit window now. We want to make sure the Edit window takes up the whole screen. On the PC, we click in the middle box in the upper right-hand corner to maximize it. On the Macintosh, it's the green dot in the upper left of the window. The Edit window provides a graphic view of our session along a timeline. This is where we edit audio, MIDI, and automation data. Tracks are displayed from top to bottom in the Edit window. In the upper area, we have our edit modes: Shuffle, Slip, Spot, and Grid. We have Zoom controls, the Edit tools, the Zoomer, Trimmer, Selector, Grabber, Scrubber, and Pencil tool, as well as location indicators. On the left is our Tracks list and Edit Groups list, and on the right is our Regions list. This contains the audio and MIDI building blocks of our session. The left and right columns can be shown or hidden by clicking on the double arrows in the lower left and right of the screen. There are numerous pop-up menus in the Edit window, which are accessed by clicking on the small pop-up menu arrow or directly on the name of the menu item. In the Mix window, our tracks are displayed from left to right in a more familiar mixer view. The Mix and Edit windows are really just 2 different views of our session. There's another window we need to be familiar with, and that's the Transport window. We can show or hide the transport window from the Windows menu too. The transport can be repositioned by clicking in the title bar area, holding, and dragging to a new location. We can use the transport to control record, play, fast forward, rewind, and other standard transport functions. From the View menu, under Edit window, we can choose to show a small version of the transport in the upper area of the Edit window as well. Now that we have a basic layout, let's learn how to save our session. We choose Save from the File menu, Control-S on the PC, and Command-S on the Macintosh. Another option is to use Save Session As. When we use Save Session As, we give our session a new name, and Pro Tools opens the newly named version. But we continue to work with the same audio files folder and other components. This is great for saving different versions of our session or saving a version at each major stage of production. I'll choose Save Session As and name it Pro Tools Basics Part 2. In this chapter, we'll learn how to set up our signal path, set levels, and record audio. We'll be joined by guitar virtuoso Craig McCreary, who will be lending his talents to our example sessions. The first thing we want to do is turn down our monitor levels before we plug anything in. Next, we'll set up our signal chain. We're using a Digi002 rack, and it's got 4 inputs that accept mic, line, or instrument level signals. I'll plug the mic into the first input on the back of the 002, and I'll check the button on the front to make sure it's set for mic. If you're using a microphone, check and see if it requires 48-volt phantom power. This one does, so I'll make sure the microphone's plugged in, and then I'll turn on the 48-volt phantom switch on the back of the 002. Next, we need to select the microphone as the input to one of our Pro Tools channels. To select an input, we just click on the input selector, and this brings up a list of all the available input choices. There are 2 kinds, interface and bus. Interface means the physical connections on our hardware, in our case the 002. The bus connections are Pro Tools' internal digital buses. Since we're connected to the first input on the 002, we'll go to the interface and select mic line 1. The output selector offers interface and bus connections too. It's set to analog 1 and 2, which are connected to our control room monitors. Pro Tools has extensive automation features. The automation mode determines how Pro Tools records and plays back automation, like fader moves. We'll work with this later in the mixing chapter. The panner controls our track position in the sound field. Below the panner are the track controls for record, mute, and solo. Then the channel fader, and below that, the track name. It's a great idea to name tracks before you record, since the track name will determine the name of the recorded audio file. All we have to do is double-click on the track name, type in the new name, in this case, acoustic guitar. Add any track comments we want, like the name of the mic or guitar, and then we just click OK. Next, we need to set our levels. Let's click on the Record enable for acoustic guitar, and we'll have Craig play a little. We can see the guitar signal in the meters. We want the level to be hot, but not clipping. If we overload the input, the clip indicator will light red. We can clear it just by clicking on it. Our goal is to get the signal as hot as possible without clipping. Here's a really important concept. In Pro Tools, we set our levels at the source. In other words, I need to turn down the preamp now. If I just bring the fader down, we'll hear less signal in the control room, but the sound we're recording will still be distorted. Let's turn our preamp down a bit and bring the fader back up. That looks good. Now let's switch to the Edit window so we can watch our recording on the screen. I'll need to make sure that the acoustic guitar track is Record enabled, rewind, and click on Record to arm the transport. Now let's click Play to start recording. and I'll click Stop to stop recording. We'll take the track out of record, and we can see the audio waveform on the screen and the region name Acoustic Guitar _01. This area is called the track's playlist, and Acoustic Guitar 01 is the region name. So we're getting a few terms together here. Sessions are made of tracks, tracks contain playlists, and playlists are made up of regions. If we look in the regions list, we see that Acoustic Guitar 01 has been added. If you can't see the whole name, you can click, hold, and drag in the margin to resize the regions list. Let's save again now that we have a recording. In this chapter, we'll learn about rulers, how to adjust our display, and how to playback from different points in our session. Let's start with rulers. The ruler view appears in our edit window just above our track playlists. There's two kinds of rulers: time-based rulers, like minutes and seconds, bars and beats, and samples, and conductor rulers, which provide tempo and meter information to our session. To see how this works, we'll go to the Windows menu and choose Big Counter. Now we'll go to the View menu and choose Rulers and All. The main time scale for our session will determine how we see things in the location indicators, transport counters, and in the Big Counter window. If we click on different time-based ruler names, we'll see our display change: minutes and seconds, bars and beats, samples. We can also select the main time scale from the pop-up menu in the Locations indicator or in the Transport counters. The time scale choice will depend on the kind of project we're working on. We can clean up our display by going to the View menu and choosing Rulers and None. The current main time scale can't be hidden, so minutes and seconds is still there. Here's something we want to watch out for. We can have more than one selection at a time in Pro Tools. This can be confusing when you're starting out. Let's check the Options menu and make sure that Link, Edit, and Timeline selection is checked. Let's learn some techniques for playing back audio in Pro Tools. The spacebar will start and stop playback. To rewind to 0, we can use Enter on the PC or Return on the Macintosh. We can't use Enter on the numeric keypad. It needs to be on the Alpha keyboard. Let's look at the waveform display in the track playlist. The waveform is displayed from left to right along a timeline. The ruler view shows us the time. The vertical axis represents our amplitude. We can adjust our track height by clicking on the track height selector. That's the small arrow in the middle of the track controls. Or by clicking in the amplitude scale area. There are 6 choices from mini to extreme. In the upper area of the edit window, between the modes and tools, are the zoom controls. The left and right arrows control our horizontal zoom. We can click on them to zoom in and out, or we can click, hold, and drag for a continuous zoom. The 2 sets of arrows in the middle control vertical zoom. The left is for audio, and the right is for MIDI. We can use Control in the left-right bracket on the PC, or Command left-right bracket on the Macintosh to adjust our horizontal zoom with keyboard shortcuts. Another option is to use the Zoom tool to adjust the display. If we click with the zoomer, we zoom in. If we hold down Alt on the PC or Option on the Mac when we click with the zoomer, we'll zoom back out. We can also click, hold, and drag with the zoomer to zoom into a specific area of the waveform. Finally, we can double-click on the zoomer to fill the screen with the longest track. Let's learn 2 more techniques for playing back before we move on. We can take our selector tool, click anywhere in a track, and hit spacebar to begin playback. If we click in a time-based ruler while we're playing back, Pro Tools will instantly update to that location. If we click and drag to make a selection, Pro Tools will play back the selection when we hit the spacebar. For precise positioning, we can key a location directly into the counters window. We have to hit Enter to finalize the input. This speed and flexibility is a big part of what makes a random access system like Pro Tools so much faster to work on than tape-based systems. In this chapter, we'll learn about destructive and non-destructive recording, and we'll see how Pro Tools names files. When we recorded, our track was named Acoustic Guitar, and Pro Tools created a region called Acoustic Guitar 01. That tells us it was the first take recorded in the acoustic guitar track. Let's get ready to record another. I'll rewind to 0, and I'll click R to enable the track for recording. Since our first take is still in the track, and we don't want to overwrite it, we want to make sure we're recording non-destructively. We'll go to the Options menu and make sure there isn't a check next to Destructive Record. There is another way to tell. If we check Destructive Record, we'll see a D appear in the Record button on the transport. If we record now, we'll overwrite our first take on the hard drive. Normally we record non-destructively in Pro Tools, so we'll uncheck that option now. Since we record in Pro Tools a lot, let's learn the shortcuts now. We can use F12 to arm the transport and start recording. Control and spacebar on the PC or Command and spacebar on the Mac will do the same thing. And we'll hit the spacebar to stop recording. We'll take the track out of Record, and now we have a region called Acoustic Guitar _02 in the track playlist. And we can also see it in the Audio Regions list. Since we were in non-destructive record mode, Pro Tools kept our original take. Let's say we want to A/B these takes to see which one we like better. Let's start by setting Acoustic Guitar and Audio 2 to a large track height. Now let's make sure we're in slip mode. The modes affect how we manipulate data in the Edit window, and they also affect the way the tools operate. Now let's select the grabber. We can go to the Regions list, click and hold on Acoustic Guitar 01 with the grabber, and just drag it out of the Audio Regions list and into Audio 2. Note that we can position it anywhere. If we let it go, we can just simply grab it and move it again. With the grabber in slip mode, you can freely move regions in time, or even slip them onto other tracks. Let's slip this all the way to the beginning of Audio 2. Now we'll solo Audio 2. We can click with the selector tool anywhere in the track and hit the spacebar to begin playback. Let's take Audio 2 out of solo now and solo the other track. That's one way of handling things. Let's double-click on Acoustic Guitar 01 with the selector. This selects the whole region. Now I'll just hit Backspace or Delete to clear it. Pro Tools has a really cool feature called the Matching Start Times Takes list. Let me explain how this works. Since both our recordings started at 0, they share the same start time. Let's double-click with the selector tool in the Acoustic Guitar region to select it. If we hold down Control on the PC or Command on the Mac while we click in the region, we'll get a list of all the regions that share the same start time, and we can select one from here. This allows us to easily switch back and forth to audition different takes right in the track. In the Preferences under the Editing tab, we can set options which determine which takes are displayed. Now let's learn how to rename files before we move on to some other things. Suppose we like the second take better, and we'd like to call it Acoustic Guitar Final. We can double-click on its name in the Regions list with any tool, or double-click on it in the playlist using the grabber. Either method brings up the Name dialog. Since we want to rename this file in the session and in the Audio Files folder on the hard drive, we'll choose Name, Region, and Disk File. Let's type in Acoustic Guitar Final and click OK or hit the Enter key. Now we see the new name in the Audio Regions list, and the file's been renamed on the hard drive too. In this section, we'll learn about screen scrolling options and playback modes. Let's get a couple more terms together. Pro Tools has two cursors. When I click in a playlist with the Selector tool, we see a flashing line on the screen. This is what we call the Edit cursor. When I start playback, we see a solid line moving across the screen. This is what's called the playback cursor. Notice that we can reposition the Edit cursor while we're playing back. When we stop Pro Tools, the playback cursor joins the Edit cursor, and it'll begin playback from there the next time we hit the spacebar. Now let's take a look at how Pro Tools handles screen scrolling. Under the Options menu are the scrolling choices: None, After Playback, and Page. If we choose None, the screen doesn't automatically scroll, even if the playback cursor travels off the screen. Scroll after playback means the screen will scroll and update once playback has stopped. If we choose the option Page, Pro Tools updates the display one full page at a time while we're playing back. The next thing we're going to cover is really important. Pro Tools has two different ways of updating the playback cursor location. Let's click with the selector at the beginning of this take and play back. Now we'll stop. When we start playback again, it's from the same position. This is ideal for listening to a passage, making adjustments, and listening again. It's also the mode we want to be in when we're making selections, creating regions, and loops. Let's look at the other option. If we go to the Setup menu and choose Preferences, and go to the Operations tab, we'll see Timeline Insertion follows Playback. Let's check that now. Now when we play back and stop Pro Tools, the playback position updates and begins again where we stopped. This mode is ideal for live recording, where we can stop between songs and pick up where we left off without having to reposition the cursor. You'll probably want to take a little time with the scroll option and Timeline Insertion follows Playback to really get a feel for how these things work together. In this section, we'll discuss settings that affect the performance of your system, and we'll discuss a strategy for managing these. Most of the important controls behind the scenes in Pro Tools are accessed from the Setup menu. One in particular can have a major effect on the performance of your system, and that's the playback engine. Pro Tools is able to process audio in real time, adding EQ, dynamics, reverb, and other mixing and processing functions as we play back. To help accomplish that, it uses a hardware cache. The hardware buffer controls the size of the cache. We want to keep our buffer settings low when we record or overdub to avoid excessive latency. Too much latency can make it really hard to play with any accuracy or feel. Later, when we're ready to mix, we can up the size to allow for more plugins and processing. Some systems, like the 002, have a low latency monitoring mode. We can access this from the Options menu. Here's another important setting. The CPU usage limit controls how much CPU power is allocated to Pro Tools. Higher limits or multiprocessor settings allow for more plugins. Lower settings might be needed if we're running other applications in the background, like Reason or Live. The DAE playback buffer determines how much memory is allocated for managing hard drive buffers. The default works pretty well here most of the time, but sessions with lots of tracks or lots of edits might require a higher setting. Remember to maintain your drives properly too. That means defragmenting and occasionally backing everything up and reformatting the drive. There's another setting that can help your hard disk performance. We'll go back to the Preferences menu and choose the Operations tab. Under Open-Ended Record Allocation, check the box next to Limit, and set this to the longest you'll be recording at any one time. This way Pro Tools will only allocate as much memory as it needs, and it can operate more efficiently this way. This is most noticeable when you're recording lots of tracks at one time. The last thing we'll talk about in this section is the hardware setup. The hardware setup will appear different from system to system. Many hardware peripherals allow you to switch inputs between analog and digital, or even change digital formats. These controls are accessed in the hardware setup. For instance, inputs 1 and 2 on the M-Box can be either analog or digital. We can also select a clock source here. Most of the time will be set to internal. But if you plan on recording digitally from a CD player or DAT machine with a digital output, you'll want to set the clock to the appropriate digital input source while you're recording, and then switch back to internal when you're playing back or editing. If all that feels a bit technical right now, don't worry. This will all make sense as you work with Pro Tools more. In this chapter, we'll learn how to set up a click and count off in Pro Tools. We'll also look at the advantages of using bars and beats time base when we're working with music. Let's start by creating a new session. First, let's add some tracks. We'll start with 4 mono audio tracks, and I'll click on plus to add another column. We'll add 1 mono auxiliary track and click on Create. Auxiliaries are additional mixer channels. In Pro Tools, we use these for all kinds of things, like submixing, creating effects returns, and as channels for software instruments. Let's switch to the Mix window. We can customize our settings from the View menu. Let's go to the Mix window and choose All. Now let's make sure our transport is showing counters and MIDI controls. To provide our click, we'll use Pro Tools' built-in click instrument. Here's how it works. I'll click on one of the inserts for the aux channel, go to Plugin, and down to the instrument category, and I'll choose the click instrument. This opens the click plugin. Now we'll double-click on the metronome icon to open the click options dialog. We'll check the first option, click during play and record. And we'll check the option for count off only during record and type in 1 bar. Now let's rename aux1 to click. Now we'll click on the metronome button to enable the click, and we'll hit the space bar and bring the fader up on the click channel. Now if we click and hold where it says factory default, we can access our preset click sounds. Let's try a couple. We can also use the plus and minus buttons to increment or decrement through the plugin presets. The sliders adjust the click levels. To really take advantage of recording to a click, let's change our main timescale to bars and beats. I'll do this right from the pop-up menu in the transport. Now let's show the big counter from the Windows menu. And I'll position these both towards the bottom of the screen. Now when we play back, we can see the bars and beats change to the click. Let's also set up the edit window. First we'll switch to grid mode. Next let's choose the grid value pop-up menu. We'll click on the small arrow to choose our grid value. This determines how the grid lines are drawn in the edit window. If we click on the name of our main timescale, it toggles the grid lines on and off. Our next step is to establish a tempo. Pro Tools has 2 tempo modes, manual and conductor. If the conductor icon on the transport isn't lit, we're in manual mode. We can simply click in the tempo field, type in a tempo, and enter. We can also click in the tempo field and tap the T key to tap a tempo in. We can change the session meter by clicking in the meter display just above the tempo. Now let's make sure our conductor rulers are showing. We can do this under the View menu by choosing Rulers, or by using the Ruler View pop-up menu. To make more efficient use of our display, we can put away rulers we're not using by holding Alt on the PC or Option on the Mac and clicking on them. When we enable the conductor on our transport, Pro Tools follows the tempo and meter changes in the conductor rulers. To add a tempo or meter change to our session, we can click on the plus sign next to tempo or meter and input a new value. Or we can hold Start on the PC or Control on the Mac and click directly in the conductor ruler at the location where we want to add the event. To remove an event, we can just click on it while holding Alt on the PC or Option on the Mac. For now, I'll turn the conductor off, and let's get back to where we were and get ready to record. I'll start by renaming Audio 1 to Rhythm Guitar. Since our mic is plugged into Input 1, I'll plug the guitar into Input 2. We need to set the channel input for Rhythm Guitar to mic line 2 where the guitar is plugged in. I'll just click on the input selector and choose mic line 2. Now let's set our levels. This time, let's use the F12 key to start recording. Let's learn about making selections in Pro Tools and using our edit modes and tools. First, let's go to the Preferences under the Operations tab and make sure that Timeline Insertion Follows Playback isn't checked. It's easy to get caught up in editing and forget to save. Let's take advantage of Pro Tools' Auto Save feature. Under the Operational Preferences, we'll check Enable Session File Auto Backup. Pro Tools will create a folder of backup copies in our session folder. We can decide how many backups to keep and how often to back up. In the event of a power failure or some other problem, Pro Tools has us covered. While we're here, let's go to the Editing tab and set up Pro Tools Multi-Level Undo. We'll choose 32 levels of undo. The first step in developing editing skills is learning how to make selections and how to toggle the modes and tools. F1, 2, 3, and 4 will access the edit modes directly, while F5 through 10 access the edit tools. Let's begin by choosing Slip Mode and the Selection tool. Larger track heights like Jumbo are great for detailed editing. To make a selection, we just click, hold, and drag. Once we have a selection, the spacebar can be used to audition it. Pro Tools zooming features are helpful when we're fine-tuning a selection. We can make adjustments by holding down the Shift key while we drag either end of the selection. You can also drag the arrows in the time-based ruler. To quickly move to the front or back of the selection, we can use the left and right arrow keys. The Scrubber tool can also be used to make selections. For this to work properly, we'll have to go to the Operational Preferences and check Edit Insertion Follows Scrub Shuttle. We'll use F9 to switch to the scrubber. To scrub audio in real time, we just click, hold, and drag in the track. If we hold the Shift key while we drag, we'll make a selection with the scrubber. Pro Tools offers a very musical way of making selections on the fly. We can mark a selection endpoint by using the down arrow. And then we just hit the up arrow to mark our out point. Pro Tools has a great feature called Zoom Toggle. With a selection made, we can click on the Zoom Toggle icon or choose the appropriate keyboard shortcut to fill the screen with our selection. When the Zoom Toggle is enabled, we can make adjustments to track height and zoom settings that will determine how Pro Tools displays our data when we access the Zoom Toggle. To return to normal view, we just click the Zoom Toggle again or use our keyboard shortcut. Once our edit cursor is positioned in a track, we can hold Shift and click anywhere else in the track to extend our selection to that point. Now let's see how making selections works in grid mode. Our main time scale is set to bars and beats, and our grid is set for quarter notes. Now the Selector tool is constrained to the quarter note grid. We can use the Grid Value pop-up menu to change to any other value, like eighth notes. Let's look at another really useful feature, Loop Playback. We can have Pro Tools loop our selection by choosing Loop Playback from the Options menu. When Loop Playback is enabled, you'll also see the circular arrow on the transport's play button. We can toggle Loop Playback on or off directly from the transport by clicking on the play button while we're holding the Start key on the PC or the Control key on the Macintosh. Turning Loop Playback on allows us to hear how well our selections loop. Pro Tools offers a very precise way of making selections by entering values directly into the Event Edit area. The slash key on the numeric keypad will cycle through the fields in the Event Edit area. Let's type 7 into the Start field and 9 into the End field and enter. When we want to select more than one of something in Pro Tools, we hold the Shift key to add additional items to our selection. I'll hold Shift as I click in Additional Track Playlist to extend my selection. Or click on a track's name and Shift-click on additional track names to add them to the selection. If we need to change the position of a track to make it easier to edit, we can simply click on the track name and drag it to a new position in the Mix or Edit window, or drag its name in the Tracks list. Now that we know a little about making selections, let's get ready to create regions. We create whole file regions or audio files whenever we record. In this section, we'll learn some new ways of creating regions. We'll learn about capturing regions and separating regions. Let's start by making a selection from bar 9 to bar 10 and turning loop playback on. We'll start with capturing a region. I'll choose Capture from the Region menu, and I'll name it 5 chord. Now we have a region called 5 chord in the Regions list. It appears in plain type instead of bold because it's not a whole file. A region simply contains pointers that point to some section of an audio file. Now let's select from bar 10 to bar 11 and listen to that looped back. These loops don't sound perfect, and that's okay. For now, the goal is to create our loops on the bar boundaries. Let's choose Capture from the Region menu again and call it 4 chord. Let's make a selection from bar 11 to bar 12, capture it, and call it 1 chord. Pro Tools allows us to audition audio directly from the Regions list. To do this, we simply hold Alt on the PC or Option on the Macintosh while we click and hold on the region name for as long as we want to audition it. Notice that when we use Capture, it doesn't create any additional edit points in the track. This is one of the main differences between that and our next topic, which is separating regions. Separate region can be used to split a region or to define a new region similar to capturing. Let's define a new region. First, we'll select all of bar 2. Now, let's choose Separate at Selection. And we'll name it bar 2. We can also set a grid value that will dictate how Pro Tools separates audio. I'll set this to quarter notes. Now if I choose Separate on Grid, Pro Tools makes separations on quarter note boundaries. Separate at Transients will make separations at peaks in the audio, making it easy to identify individual beats or points of emphasis. When we choose On Grid or at Transients, the Pre-Separate Amount dialog appears, allowing us to account for audio that occurs ahead of the grid or peak, like an instrument with a slow attack, for example. Let's work with the original separation we named bar 2. Notice that since we separated this region, Pro Tools created new regions on either side. We call these auto-created regions. If we want to rename the region to the left, I'll just double-click on it with the grabber and type in bar 1. Now let's make a simple cut. I'll take the Selector tool and position it at bar 12 and choose Separate Region to create a basic cut in the track. Since we're going to want 2 passes of our 12-bar blues, let's drag our whole file region back into bar 13. And let's create a turnaround bar at bar 12. As long as we're in grid mode, I can drag the 5 chord in and snap it right to bar 12. So far, we've worked with slip mode and grid mode. Pro Tools has 2 additional modes, Shuffle and Spot. Spot mode is used primarily in post-production for spotting up sound effects to picture, but we can use spot mode anytime we need precise placement. Let's drag our 4 chord out of the Audio Regions list in Spot mode. This brings up the Spot dialog. We can choose a timescale here and spot the start, end, or a sync point within the region to any point in our session. Let's spot the start of the 4 chord to bar 2, beat 1. In shuffle mode, regions behave kind of like magnets. If we drag our 1 chord into an empty track, it shuffles it to the beginning of our session. Let's drag in 2 more copies of the 1 chord and see how they shuffle together. Now let's shuffle in a 4 chord between the first 2 1 chords. The on-screen highlight ensures that we shuffle our region into the right place. The regions behind our 4 chord shuffle back. Let's add another 4 chord. If we delete a region in shuffle mode, the regions that follow it will shuffle forward. This mode can be really handy for arranging loops and for editing voiceover, where it's not uncommon to want to remove hesitations, pauses, or even breaths to make things flow properly. Pro Tools edit modes offer a lot of functionality. Remember, in shuffle mode, regions behave like magnets. The type of shuffle will vary depending on the edit. Slip mode allows us to freely move regions in time. Spot mode is often used to picture and allows for precise placement of sound. And grid mode constrains our selections and movements to the edit window grid, which is determined by the setting in the grid value pop-up menu. Next, let's look at some of the commands we can use to manipulate data in the edit window. We'll start with the basics. Let's just make a selection, choose Copy from the Edit menu, position our cursor, and choose Paste. Here's a nice shortcut. We can triple-click in the track to select everything. And now I'll just hit Delete. Pro Tools includes 2 powerful features for repeating regions: Duplicate and Repeat. Let's shuffle our 1 chord back into the playlist and choose Duplicate from the Edit menu. Now we'll duplicate it a couple more times with the keyboard shortcut, Control-D on the PC or Command-D on the Macintosh. Duplicate is a really quick and handy option. Our other technique, Repeat, gives us a powerful option for creating multiple copies. With our 1 chord selected, I'll choose Repeat and simply key in the number of copies I need, in this case 15. Okay, let's clear this track now and take it out of solo. We'll go back to the tracks list and show rhythm guitar. Let's make sure we're back in grid mode. We'll select the first 12 bars and choose Duplicate. This will give us 2 full passes of our 12-bar blues. Now let's get ready to clean things up a bit. In this section, we'll learn how to trim regions and use fades to smooth our edits. Remember, a region is simply a pointer to some part of a whole file. In Pro Tools, we can trim the region boundaries to reveal more or less of the parent sound file. Let me illustrate. Let's start by bringing our 4 chord region into Audio 2, and we'll set the track height to Jumbo. Now let's use F6 to select our trim tool. With the trimmer, we can click, hold, and drag on either side of the region to reveal more or less of the parent sound file. In fact, it's possible to reveal the entire parent sound file. Notice that the trimmer automatically changes direction as we cross the midpoint of the region. We don't have to click and drag. We can simply click where we want to trim. We can change the direction of the trimmer regardless of its position in the region by holding Alt on the PC or Option on the Macintosh. Also notice that since we're in grid mode, the trimmer is constrained to the grid. Let's clear this for now and learn some more navigation and selection techniques using the Tab key. With our cursor positioned in a track, the Tab key will move us to the next region boundary. If we hold Control on the PC or Option on the Macintosh, the Tab key will move us to the previous region boundary. To make a selection, we can hold Shift as we tab forward to the next region boundary. To select to the previous region boundary, we can use Shift-Control tab on the PC or Shift-Option tab on the Macintosh. Pro Tools has a feature called Tab to Transients. This is enabled by clicking the Tab to Transients icon in the Edit window options bar. When enabled, the Tab key moves the cursor to peaks in the audio waveform. We can add the Shift key to make selections. This is especially useful for making selections and loops from rhythmic material. Next, let's switch to slip mode and zoom in on the edit between bar 1 and bar 2. We can use the trimmer to adjust our region boundaries and clean up the edits. We'll add a little more attack on the 4-chord region. And let's see how fades can help smooth the process. We'll make a small selection across the edit point. We'll go to the Edit menu, we'll choose Fades and Create. This brings up the Fade dialog. There are controls here for zooming and viewing the fade or crossfade in various different ways. We have preset fade shapes to choose from. We can also choose a standard or S-curve. These can be adjusted by clicking, holding, and dragging directly on the fade. When we're crossfading, we can choose from linked fades or unlinked fades, which allow separate shapes on each side. Let's try a basic equal gain linear fade. We'll click on OK to render the fade and place it directly on the region boundary. The fade's okay, but there is a small drop in volume here. We can edit the fade just by double-clicking on it with the grabber, and that opens the fade dialog again. This time, we'll try an equal power fade. Equal power fades retain a little more amplitude across the fade. For fine-tuning in the track, we can use the trimmer to adjust the fade length. Let's look at batch fades. If our selection crosses multiple region boundaries, when we bring up the Fades dialog box, we'll see the options for batch fades. This is a quick way to smooth a number of edits at one time. If we have a lot of edits across a lot of tracks, this can cause our hard drive to work overtime, and it can make our sessions more difficult to play back. Pro Tools has the ability to combine multiple regions and fades into a new region. We call this consolidating. Let's start by selecting all the regions that we want to consolidate. Now we'll choose Consolidate from the Edit menu. Consolidate combines all the regions we selected into a new whole file audio region or audio file. We could spend a lot of time in this section. The reality is, editing is a skill that takes practice. The good news is, with Pro Tools, you can become a good editor in a reasonably short amount of time. In this section, we'll set up to record additional tracks, punch in and out, and learn how to monitor audio in Pro Tools. Pro Tools has two monitoring modes: automatic input monitoring and input-only monitoring. It's really important to understand the difference. Input-only monitoring monitors the input to the track all the time. This is needed when we're rehearsing. Otherwise, Pro Tools monitors what's coming off the hard drive, not the input to the track. In auto input, Pro Tools monitors what's coming off the hard drive and automatically switches to input when we're recording. We can toggle this back and forth from the Tracks menu. Since we already have a rhythm part, let's open the Click Options dialog and set the click to only during count-off. We can turn off only during record, and that way we'll have a count-off during rehearsal too. Let's get started by renaming Audio 2 to Lead Guitar. Let's check our input. We'll switch to the Mix window and make sure that our input is set to Mic Line 2 where the guitar is plugged in. Now we'll turn on input-only monitoring so Craig can rehearse with the track. If you initiate recording and don't get started right, or don't want to complete the pass, you can use Control Period on the PC or Command Period on the Macintosh to discard the take without creating a sound file. Let's go ahead and record the lead. Let's learn how to punch in and use pre-roll. This track sounds great, but suppose we'd like to punch in from bar 5 to bar 7. Our first step is to make a selection from bar 5 to bar 7. For punching in, we'll want to switch to Auto Input Monitoring. Auto Input Monitoring will allow Craig to hear his lead up until the punch point. Then Pro Tools will switch to monitor the live input during recording. Our last step in setting up the punch is to set up pre-roll and post-roll. We can turn pre- and post-roll on by clicking on them on the transport. We'll type in 2 bars of pre-roll and 1 bar of post-roll and enter. The pre- and post-roll flags appear in the time-based rulers. We can adjust the values by dragging the flags. It's okay to turn off the 1 bar count-off now that we've set up pre-roll. Now we're set up and ready to punch in. Let's learn about another great Pro Tools feature called Loop Recording. We can choose it from the Options menu. When Loop Record's enabled, we'll see the loop symbol on the Record button in the transport. First, we'll make a selection. When we loop record, we'll hear our pre-roll the first time, and then Pro Tools will loop record over our selection until we stop the transport. When we loop record, we also have the option to take advantage of the matching start times takes list. We'll need to go to the Preferences under the Editing tab. For our purposes, we'll turn on all 3 options. Take region names that match track names, so we only get our lead guitar. Take region lengths that match, so we only get our punches. And the separate option, so if we make a separation in a track, all of our matching takes will contain separations as well. Let's see how this works. We'll make a separation at bar 6. Now we have a matching list at bar 5 and at bar 6. And since the separation operated on all the related takes, we can easily try different combinations. Of course, we'll probably still need to trim and fade to clean up our edits when we're done. When we record and play back MIDI, we record data that represents note values, velocities, program changes, and many other things. Some devices interface directly with the computer over the USB port. Others have 5-pin MIDI connectors and require some kind of MIDI interface. A 002, 002 rack, and MBOX 2 have built-in MIDI ports. So does a Command 8. With an original MBOX, you might add something like a MIDI Sport 4x4. Once things are connected, let's look at how Pro Tools handles MIDI setup. Let's start with a new session, and we can just stay with the defaults, and let's name it MIDI Basics. Now we'll create our tracks. Let's start with 1 mono aux, 1 stereo aux, and 3 MIDI tracks. We have 2 devices with MIDI ports, the 002 rack and the Command 8 control surface. To configure our devices, we'll go to the Setup menu under MIDI and choose MIDI Studio. This is one area where the PC and Macintosh are a little different. On the PC, this brings up the MIDI Studio Setup window. This is built into Pro Tools on Windows. On the Mac, this launches the Audio MIDI Setup, which is a separate application included with OS X. We have an M-Audio controller keyboard, and we'll need to let Pro Tools know where it's connected. We're connected to the MIDI in and the first MIDI out of the 002 rack. On the PC, we'll click on Create to create a new instrument, and we'll name it Radium 49. Next, we'll go to the input port selector and select the 002. And we'll select the first port of the 002 from the output selector. We can define MIDI channels here. This is useful for devices that receive or transmit on multiple channels. We'll set the radium to 1 and 1. On the Macintosh, we click on Add Device in the AMS window. Let's double-click on the device icon and type in our name, Radium49. And just like in the MIDI Studio Setup window, we'll set our channels to 1 and 1. We can enable MIDI beat clock or MIDI timecode from here if we're using an external sequencer, drum machine, or keyboard that we want to synchronize to Pro Tools. Let's click Apply and make our MIDI connections. We'll click on the out arrow of the Radium and drag it to the MIDI input of the 002, and from output 1 of the 002 to the input of the Radium49. If you have a synchronizer or a control surface like the Command 8 or Control 24, these are enabled from the Setup menu under Peripherals. In the Peripherals dialog, there's tabs for the different categories of devices. The Command 8 is a MIDI controller. It's connected to the computer's USB port. Let's put the Command 8 online. We'll choose MIDI controllers and select Command 8 under Type. Next, we choose the Receive From and Send To ports. On the PC, this will be labeled C8 Surface, and on the Macintosh, it'll say Command 8 Port 1. Then we just click on OK to put the Command 8 online. The Command 8 provides 8 motorized fader strips, channel controls, a control room monitoring section, transport controls, and direct access to tons of Pro Tools features. Now that we're set up, let's learn the basics of using MIDI in Pro Tools. We'll reconfigure the Edit window to show both inserts and I/O. Let's insert our Click plugin on aux 1. This is under the Instruments category, and let's set it to Cowbell 3. And let's rename the aux to Click. We can adjust our levels in the Edit window since we're showing the I/O view. Let's bring up the volume on our aux tracks. We'll click where it says Volume and bring the fader up. Since we're working with MIDI, let's make sure our time scale is set to bars and beats. And we're in grid mode. For now, we want to hear our click in play and record. And a 1-bar count off is good. And let's make sure we're in manual tempo mode. Now we need a MIDI sound source. Since our controller doesn't have built-in sounds, let's use a plug-in instrument. Let's start by renaming aux2 to SampleTank 2. Our next step is to insert the virtual instrument on our auxiliary. We'll choose Multi-Channel Instrument and SampleTank 2. The symbol RTAS indicates that it's a real-time audio suite plugin. HD systems also support real-time TDM plugins. MIDI is in essence a 16-channel protocol. In other words, 16 channels per MIDI connection. I'll just click here on SampleTank next to channel 1. And we'll use SampleTank's browser to try to find some drum sounds. Let's load this 808 electronic kit. I'll just double-click to load it into the first channel, and we can click on the keyboard to audition the different sounds. Let's check a couple of MIDI setup options before we move on. We'll go to Setup, MIDI, Input Devices, and make sure the Radium49 is enabled. We also want to check and make sure that MIDI through is turned on. This way our keyboard data will flow through to SampleTank and other MIDI devices. Now let's go to the output selector for MIDI channel 1 and choose SampleTank 2, channel 1. Pro Tools becomes aware of any virtual instrument as soon as it's instantiated. Now we'll name the MIDI track Kick and Snare. And we'll set the track height to large. Now let's set up our tempo, and we'll use Pro Tools' Tap Tempo feature. We can just click in the tempo field and tap the T key to establish our tempo. And let's rewind to make sure we're at the beginning. And now we're going to use Pro Tools' Wait for Note feature to start recording. When we click on Wait for Note, Pro Tools will wait until it sees MIDI information to start recording. Let's zoom in and learn some techniques for viewing and editing MIDI data. We see a graphic view of the MIDI notes we played. We can also see how close our notes fall to the grid. Now we'll use the Grid Value pop-up menu to change the grid to eighth note triplets. We can audition notes just by clicking on them with the grabber. We can also drag notes to reposition them. In grid mode, they'll snap to the grid. We can use the Track View selector to choose from all different kinds of views for our MIDI data, like velocity, regions, or notes. The MIDI region view offers something very similar to our audio regions view. We can grab regions and move them, or trim them. One of the more common things to change on a MIDI track is velocity. Each of these stalks represents how hard we played a note. We can click, hold, and drag to manipulate an individual stalk, or we can select a range of notes and use the trimmer to affect the velocity of all of them. We can also insert notes directly into a track playlist using the pencil tool. Let's add a hand clap at bar 1 beat 4 and bar 3 beat 4. Let's talk about a common MIDI editing function called quantize. Quantizing MIDI data means pulling it toward a grid based on a musical value, like eighth note, 16th note, or quarter note triplet. I'll select the notes I want to edit and choose Event, MIDI, Quantize. Let's choose eighth note and triplet. Pro Tools offers a lot of features for quantize, including swing, and a whole section that lets you control what gets quantized and how much it gets pulled toward the grid. We'll go ahead and click on Apply to quantize our selection. Let's look at another way of inserting notes in the Edit window. For this, we'll set our edit grid to quarter notes. We'll go to the pencil tool, click, and hold to set its function to line. Since our grid is set to quarter note, we can actually drag a quarter note pattern in the playlist. Let's find a shaker sound. Now let's get ready to add a bass line. We'll use MIDI Channel 2. Let's start by renaming MIDI 2 to Bass. And we'll select Sample Tank Channel 2 from the Output selector. Now let's go back to the Sample Tank plugin and find a bass sound. When a device can play back more than one sound at a time, we call it multi-timbral. Let's put in a bass line now. And let's quantize the bass line too. Earlier we used the duplicate and repeat commands. Let's learn another technique. Let's shift-click on the bass and drum regions so they're both selected, and we'll hold Alt on the PC or Option on the Mac and drag them to bar 5 to make a copy. The last thing we want to cover in MIDI editing basics is transposition. Let's select the bass region at bar 5, and I'll choose Event, MIDI, Transpose. We'll set it for 2 semitones or a whole step. MIDI data is very flexible. Changing pitch and tempo is very easy in the MIDI domain. We've seen how MIDI tracks and auxiliary inputs can work together. Pro Tools Instrument Track combines these into one convenient track type. Let's go to Track, New, and choose Instrument Track. And let's go to the View menu and make sure we can see instruments and real-time properties in the Edit window. Now we'll insert our virtual instrument directly on the instrument track instead of using an aux. In the Instruments column, we'll choose Sample Tank from the output. And let's record a quick take directly into the instrument track. The MIDI data is recorded directly into our instrument track. Earlier, we looked at basic MIDI editing and we applied quantization and other changes to our data. Let's take a look at Pro Tools real-time properties. These are available on MIDI and instrument tracks. We'll click Quantize and choose eighth notes. Pro Tools applies the setting in real time. Now, let's drag the swing parameter up to restore some of the original feel, only tighter. We can affect the duration of the notes, offset the track, scale the velocity, and transpose. Let's scale the velocity to bring out more of the tined sound. Finally, let's see how this would sound transposed up a whole step. Unlike the edits we did earlier, real-time properties only affect the playback of our data and are ideal while we're still experimenting with the key and feel of our song. Now that we've worked with audio and MIDI, we're going to put things together and build a project. We'll create a new session. We'll stick with the defaults. We'll name it Good For You, and we'll store it on the audio hard drive. Now let's create some new tracks. 4 stereo tracks, 8 mono tracks, 3 stereo auxes, 3 MIDI tracks, and 2 stereo master faders. We'll start by learning how to import some drum loops into Pro Tools. Let's try using a Digibase browser. Digibase is Pro Tools' built-in database engine. Let's choose Show Workspace from the Windows menu and use the Workspace browser to locate some drum loops. Most professional loop libraries have their BPMs attached to the name in one way or another. Now, let's click on the search icon. Our first step with Digibase is to make sure the volumes we want to search are checked. I'll check audio. And I'll type 120 into the find field. And under kind, we'll choose audio file. Then we just click search, and Digibase displays its findings below in the results pane. From here, it's easy to audition any of the files. We simply highlight one and hit the spacebar. The up and down arrows can be used to navigate to different files. If we want to hear the file looped, we simply hold down Alt on the PC or Option on the Macintosh when we hit spacebar to play it back. Digibase supports all kinds of files, including session documents, audio files, MIDI files, Rex and ACID files, and much more. Digibase displays the number of bars and beats and the original tempo for Rex files. Rex and ACID files are audio file types that are designed to scale their tempos with minimal artifacts. To see this in action, we'll need to set our audio track to follow ticks or the MIDI clock instead of samples. Now we'll see our Rex file stay locked to the beat and change tempos with our session tempo. If our track is set to follow samples, our audio doesn't scale to the session's MIDI tempo. Rex and ACID files provide a lot of flexibility and are especially useful when we're still experimenting with tempo and arrangement. Before we bring any of these into Pro Tools, we need to talk about a really important point. If the files we're importing match the audio file settings we chose for our session, Pro Tools can just add the audio to our session. Essentially, our session document will just point to these files wherever they reside. This is okay, as long as nothing gets moved later. But let's not take a chance. Let's go to the Preferences and the Operations tab and check Automatically Copy Files on Import. This will cause Pro Tools to automatically make a copy of anything we import in our session's audio files folder. Now let's see how we can bring some of these grooves into Pro Tools. We can drag a file right out of Digibase and drop it directly into a track in the Edit window, or into the Regions list. I'll click, hold, and drag a box around a number of these. We can add these to our session by just dragging them into the Regions list. We can also drag a file directly onto the Tracks list. This will create a new track while loading the audio file into the Tracks playlist. We have a full range of importing options under File, Import. from session data and audio files to MIDI data and QuickTime movies. We can choose Import Audio to Track to import audio and create a new track at the same time. I'll choose Import Audio to Regions list. Next, we'll navigate to the percussion folder. There are controls for additioning files from here too. Since these files are reasonably small, we'll just bring them all in for choice. We'll shift-click to select the files we want, and we'll choose Copy, not Add. Pro Tools will ask us where we want to store the files, and it defaults to the Audio Files folder for our session. This is where we want to store them, so they'll stay with our session. Notice the triangle next to the audio file names in the Audio Regions list. This indicates they're multi-channel. We can click on the disclosure triangle to reveal the individual mono files. Pro Tools works with multi-mono files, not stereo interleave files. We can import stereo interleave files, and Pro Tools will automatically create the left and right sides for us. We can also generate stereo interleave files. Most CD authoring programs require this. We'll look at that when it's time to mix down. Now that we've imported some loops, let's build a foundation for our track. We'll make sure we're in grid mode, and let's make sure the tempo is set to 120, the same tempo as our loops. Let's start by dragging the loop named Hat1 into one of our stereo tracks. We'll place it at bar 3, and we'll rename the track to Drum Loops. Our loop from Naked Drums fits the 120 beat per minute grid exactly, so we don't need to do any editing. Let's duplicate this 3 times. Now let's switch to the busier Hat Loop 2 to build momentum in the back half of the verse. And let's duplicate that 3 times. For a little variety, let's try adding the shaker pattern to the back half of the verse. The sound is good, but the shaker loop's a little slow. If we zoom in, we'll see that it extends out beyond the bar line. In Pro Tools, some of the tools have alternate modes. The trimmer has an alternate mode called the Time Compression Expansion, or TCE trimmer. I'll click and hold on the trimmer to reveal the alternate modes and choose TCE. Since we're in grid mode, when we use the TCE trimmer, it compresses the loop to fit perfectly in the bar boundaries. This is working really well, so let's go ahead and use the repeat command and repeat this 7 times. And we'll rename Audio 3 to Shaker. Let's switch to the mix window for a minute, and we'll just set some rough levels for these tracks. Now let's switch back to the edit window. At bar 19, our chorus comes in. Let's switch from a hi-hat to a ride loop. And let's repeat that 7 times. If we click at bar 19 and shift-click at bar 27, we'll select all 8 bars. And we can duplicate that whole selection to fill the chorus. Now let's add this tambourine loop at bar 19 where the chorus comes in too. This loop's also a little bit slow, so we'll use the TCE trimmer again. Remember, if our tambourine was a Rex file, we could scale the tempo without using the TCE trimmer. We don't want things to sound too busy, so we'll switch to the slip mode and try to thin this part out a little. We'll just select and delete a couple sections here. Now let's bring up the fades dialog to smooth things over. Since we have multiple region boundaries selected, it comes up set for batch fades. We'll keep the fade length short so we don't lose attack. Now let's listen to the results. Now we want to make this a little easier to duplicate. With a 1-bar selection, I'll go to the Edit menu and choose Consolidate Selection. This time, instead of using Duplicate or Repeat, we'll go to the Regions menu and choose Loop. We can select a number of loops, have Pro Tools loop until the end of the session, or until we reach another region in the track, or enter the loop length in bars, in this case 16. We can automatically smooth the loop section with fades. Now we can see the loop icon displayed in the region. We can use the trimmer to trim the entire loop section. If we hold Start on the PC or Control on the Macintosh, we'll trim by individual loop iterations. A really cool feature here is the loop trimmer. This is engaged by placing the trimmer directly over the loop icon. Now we can trim the length of the loop itself and have the change reflected in all the loop copies. Notice the number of bars that the loop section is filling doesn't change. This is a really flexible arrangement tool. I'll go ahead and fill out the lead section, and then we'll come back and add some drum fills starting at bar 10. Let's make sure we're in grid mode, and we'll drag fill 1 in to bar 10. Now let's play it back. Okay, there's a pop in the transition, and the fill feels in general a little too long. Let's try trimming this first region out into the top of bar 10. Now we have a half bar fill. And we'll listen back. Now let's go ahead and add a fill leading into the chorus. Muting regions can provide a flexible approach to auditioning different arrangements. We'll try muting the shaker during the fill that leads into the chorus. We'll just select the shaker region. We'll go to the region menu and choose Mute. Muting can be toggled on or off with Control-M on Windows and Command-M on the Macintosh. Earlier in the session, we imported some stereo cymbal samples. The disclosure triangle next to the region name allows us to access the individual mono elements of a multi-channel file. I'll just drag the left side of Crash 1 into Audio 5. Since Audio 5 is a mono track, this will work fine. Let's go ahead and put a fade on the end of the region. We'll rename the track to Crash 1. Many of these functions, like panning, setting levels, and switching windows, can be done right here from the Command 8. I'll finish up here by using the Command 8 to rough mix our session. And I'll finish putting in our fills, cymbal crashes, and other rhythm elements. We talked a little bit about real-time RTAS and TDM plugins. In this section, we'll learn about another plugin type in Pro Tools called Audio Suite. Audio Suite plugins don't operate in real time. Instead, they create new source files or modify existing files. Actually, we've already been using one. When we use the TCE trimmer, it's using an Audio Suite plugin to time compress or expand the audio. We can see the new audio files in the regions list with the extension TCEX for time compression expansion. Let's see how we can use Audio Suite plugins from the Audio Suite menu. Let's drag the stereo region Crash 1 into the Crash 1 and 2 tracks. A stereo region can be dragged into 2 adjacent mono tracks, so this is no problem. We'll place it at bar 2, and let's set the track view to waveform. Make sure we're in grid mode. Next, we'll trim both sides of the crash so they fit in the intro bar. Now, we'll shift-click to select both regions, go to the Audio Suite menu, and under Other, we'll choose Reverse. There's a lot of options in Audio Suite, but the one we need to make sure and select right now is Use in Playlist. This tells Pro Tools to create the new file and use it in the track's playlist. Audio Suite offers a preview control, and when we're ready, we can click Process. Next, let's select our drum fill. We can access the plugin selector from inside the Audio Suite window. For the drums, we'll go to Modulation and choose Flanger. And we'll click on Preview, make some adjustments, make sure Use in Playlist is selected, and we'll click on Process. The decision of whether to use an Audio Suite or an RTAS plugin isn't always simple. In some cases, like reversing our symbol, AudioSuite is the only option. So that was an easy decision. Same with the TCE trimmer. We might process a file with AudioSuite to free up real-time resources in our mix. We could take a track that was using an RTAS delay, for instance, and process the whole track with the same delay settings using AudioSuite. Then we could remove the RTAS plugin and free up processing power for something else in the mix. Now that we have a basic arrangement, let's make it a little easier to navigate to the different parts of our song. We'll use markers to identify our major sections. We can always show the markers from the View menu or from the Ruler View pop-up menu. Let's start by clicking in the Drum Loops playlist at the start of the intro bar. To add a new memory location, we simply hit Enter on the numeric keypad to bring up the Memory Locations window. Although markers and memory locations offer a lot of functionality, our needs right now are basic. We'll make sure we're set to marker. The reference is set for bar beat. We'll type in intro and enter. Now we see our intro marker in the markers ruler. Remember, we can use the tab key to advance to region boundaries. Let's mark our verse, chorus, lead, and we'll place a mark where we want to start our fade out. Let's show all of our memory locations by choosing Memory Locations from the window menu. Now let's look at some of the other kinds of information we can store in memory locations. Let's start by naming Audio 8 Lead Guitar. We'll make a selection from the intro to the end. Now, let's hold Alt or Option while we click on the zoomer. It's another way to zoom our selection. We'll set our lead guitar track height to large, and we'll hit Enter on the numeric keypad to bring up the Memory Locations dialog. This time, we'll store our selection, our zoom settings, our track show height status, and track heights, and we'll name it Guitar Lead. We can recall memory locations in Pro Tools by typing period, the number of the location, and period a second time on the numeric keypad. Memory locations have all sorts of useful applications in Pro Tools. Learning how to use them is central to having well-organized sessions. Now that we have our loop arrangement put together, let's go ahead and lay the harmonic foundation for our song with MIDI before we put down guitars and vocals. Let's make sure the edit window is showing both inserts and I/O views. We'll insert Sample Tank 2 on aux 1 and rename it to Sample Tank. We're going to learn some more advanced keyboard shortcuts in this section, but let's start simple. If we hold Alt or Option while we click on the volume display for Sample Tank 2, it'll bring the fader up to 0. Now for something a bit more advanced. We can hold Control-Alt on the PC or Command-Option on the Mac while we select Sample Tank Channel 1 from the output selector of MIDI 1. This will set the output of our 3 MIDI tracks to the first 3 MIDI channels of Sample Tank 2. For our tune, we'll assign a Rhodes, a bass, and an organ to channels 1, 2, and 3 in Sample Tank 2. Here's another more advanced keyboard shortcut. As long as one of our MIDI tracks is record enabled, we can hold Control on the PC or Command on the Macintosh and use the up-down arrows to record enable our different MIDI tracks. We can do this while we're recording or just to audition the sounds. Let's name our tracks now. I'll double-click MIDI 1 and name it ST Rhodes. And with the track name dialog still open, I can hold Control on the PC or Command on the Macintosh and use the left and right arrows to rename additional tracks. We'll name the next tracks ST Bass and ST Organ. Let's use our memory locator to go to the intro, and we'll put the Rhodes track down first. Next, let's add the bass part. Now let's take advantage of some of Pro Tools' more advanced quantize controls. We'll set quantize for eighth notes, and we'll set exclude within to 10%, so anything within 10% of the grid won't get quantized. We'll set the strength to 80%, so notes only get pulled 80% of the way to the grid. This will tighten things up, but retain the human feel. Let's take a quick look at how we can view and edit MIDI controller information like pitch bend. With the pencil tool, we can actually draw information like modulation and pitch bend directly into a track's playlist. Let's recall the marker for the chorus, set 1 bar pre-roll, and record the organ part. Once we're cool with the key and arrangement, sometimes it can be advantageous to turn our MIDI tracks into digital audio, especially if we're using virtual instruments. This will free up a ton of processing power. In other cases, we'll want access to individual mix elements, plugins, or Pro Tools high-resolution audio faders. Fortunately, this is pretty easy, but we'll need Pro Tools internal digital buses to do it. Our MIDI tracks are playing back Sample Tank 2, and it's inserted on an aux. Our goal is to record the output of the Sample Tank plugin to an audio track. Let's reposition the Sample Tank aux next to the Rhodes track. Let's select the Sample Tank aux, and we'll create a new stereo audio track. When a track is selected and we create a new track, the new track is created right next to it. And let's name it Rhodes. Here's the important part. We'll go to the output selector of the Sample Tank aux and set it to bus 1 and 2. Next, we'll complete the connection by setting the input of the Rhodes audio track to bus 1 and 2. We'll solo the Sample Tank aux and the audio track and the ST Rhodes MIDI track so we don't hear the organ and bass. Now all we need to do is recall the intro marker and go into record. Once we've converted all our MIDI tracks to digital audio, we can mute the MIDI tracks and then hide them from the tracks list. If we want to keep the Sample Tank aux in our session but gain the resources back, we can go to the Tracks menu and choose Make Inactive. Or go to the Mix window, click on the track type icon, and make it inactive. Let's set some rough levels for our new tracks, and we'll get ready to move on. There are a ton of great virtual instruments available for Pro Tools. Visit DigiDesign's website for a comprehensive list. We've used IK Multimedia's Sample Tank 2 in this production, but I want to introduce you to two instruments from DigiDesign's new Advanced Instrument Research Group, Expand and Hybrid. Let's create a couple of instrument tracks and make sure we're showing the instrument controls in the Edit window. We'll create a quick film-style ambient cue using Expand for the bed and Hybrid for the melody. Expand is a free RTAS instrument that includes both sample playback and synthesis features. I'll insert Expand on an instrument track. Expand is very user-friendly and comes with over 1,000 presets nicely organized into useful categories. We can layer up to 4 of these sounds in Expand. Let's choose a loop. and we'll layer it with a pad. And we can just mix them a little bit. Let's add one more sound. We'll click on the arpeggiator page and set up the arpeggiation for the tine sound. We can choose from a bunch of different patterns, and of course all of these will sync to our session tempo. Now let's record our chordal bed. Now, Expand has two built-in effect processors. Let's set up a hall reverb. Now we can use Send 1 on any of our presets to add reverb to them. I'll go ahead and choose Tape Echo as the second effect and add it to our tine sound. Let's turn off the other two parts for a minute. Expand even includes the option of feeding the first effect processor with the output of the second. We have a set of global controls and controls for each part. We're only scratching the surface here, but hopefully you get a sense of some of the possibilities with Expand. Hybrid has a similar intuitive user interface, although it's a very deep synthesizer. Hybrid incorporates subtractive and wavetable synthesis for a massive sonic palette. It also includes very powerful sequencing and arpeggiation features. Let's see how easy it is to accomplish a common function. I want to route the filter cutoff for Hybrid to a control on my M-Audio controller keyboard. I can just right-click on the PC or control-click on the Macintosh directly on the control, and I'll choose Learn, and simply move a controller on the keyboard, and we're all set. I'm not going to try to cover Hybrid extensively in this video, but let's select one of the lead sounds to complete our cue. I'll choose Asian Pipe Dream, and we'll finish up by recording an improvised melody. In this section, we'll record the guitars and vocals for our song. Craig will be back with us, and we'll also be joined by vocalist Lori Shane. Lori's a studio owner and an avid Pro Tools user. She'll be providing lead and harmony vocals for the song. Ideally, we'd like to use a vocal booth or a live room to record anything that we need to mic up. This way, we can isolate our instruments and vocals from noise, and we can also treat our space to achieve good acoustics. Anything that we record direct, like electronic keyboards, we can track right in the control room. Electric guitar is not a problem here either, since we're plugging directly into the 002. We'll use the 3 and 4 outputs on our 002 to create a separate headphone mix. We'll connect the 3 and 4 outputs to the inputs of a stereo headphone amp. That part's easy. Let's see how we set it up in Pro Tools. We'll start by making sure the mix window is showing all views. Audio, aux, and instrument tracks have 5 inserts and 10 sends. I'll put away sends F through J for now. Sends have different view options. Under the View menu and sends A through E, let's choose Send A instead of Assignments, which shows all 5 sends. Again, our options here are Interface or Bus. In this case, we'll use Interface outputs 3 and 4 to feed our headphone amplifier. I'll hold Alt or Option while I select 3 and 4 from Send A. That'll create a send on all of our channels at one time. By using a send, we can have a headphone mix that's completely independent of our control room mix. Let's go to Setup, I/O, and see how naming our paths can make mixing much more intuitive. We'll start at the Output tab. Analog 1 and 2 are connected to our control room monitors, so we'll rename 1 and 2 to Control Room. Remember, Analog 3 and 4 are connected to our headphone amp, so we'll rename it Q-Mix. Next, we'll go to the Input tab. We can click the disclosure triangle next to 1 and 2 to reveal the individual mono inputs. We'll rename the first input to Nova Mic, where our mic's connected, and we'll name the second input Guitar. Let's click on OK and return to the mix window so we can see our new path names in the mixer. Now let's see how we can use memory locations to help us set up our session. Since we already have a lead track, let's rename 2 mono audio tracks to Rhythm Guitar 1 and 2. We'll set all 3 guitar tracks to Input 2. We just relabeled that Guitar. And we'll pan the rhythm part slightly left and right. Next, we'll shift-click on the 3 guitar tracks so they're selected. Now we'll go to the Tracks list and choose Show Only Selected Tracks. We'll set the track height to large for all the guitar tracks, and we'll hit Enter to create a memory location. This time we'll choose None from Time Properties. We'll choose Zoom Settings, Track Show Hides, and Track Heights from the General Properties area. We'll call it Guitar View, and I'll go ahead and create a similar view for vocals. We'll record our rhythm guitars first, so I'll recall our guitar view from the Memory Locations window. Next, we'll recall the intro marker. Let's insert the SansAmp plugin on the rhythm guitar channel. This way we have a lot of tonal options. We'll choose the preset called Super Clean for now and boost the low end just a little bit. Later, if we don't like the sound in the mix, we can change the head, cabinet, or even the effects entirely. Let's go ahead and lay down the first rhythm part. For the other rhythm part, let's have Craig lay down a track with a little more crunch. Let's recall our vocal view, and let's set up a reverb before we start recording vocals. I'll start by inserting Deverb on aux2, and I'll call up a plate setting. And we'll rename aux2 medium plate. Let's set the input to the reverb to bus 3 and 4. And we'll change our sends view to show send B. Next, I'll shift-click to select the 3 vocal tracks. Now, if we hold Shift-Alt on the PC or Shift-Option on the Macintosh, when we create the send, we'll create it only on our selected channels. This saves a ton of time in mixing setups. We'll need to set the send to bus 3 and 4. That's the input to the aux where Deverb is inserted. Now we can see the connection. The last step is to bring our send levels up so each track is sending to the reverb. Now let's put our lead vocal into record, recall the intro marker, and lay down our first pass of lead vocals. That sounds great, but it's always good to record a couple passes of lead vocal, so we have a variety of choices for each line. We'll record 2 more passes of the lead vocal. Next, we'll have Lori add some harmony parts to her lead vocal. It's common in production to double the background vocal parts. We'll have Lori sing the part again, since that'll add another dimension to our mix, and it'll sound more natural than making a digital copy. That sounds really good. Let's recall our guitar lead from the Memory Locations window and get ready to lay down the lead part.
Yes, I'm good for you. I'm good for you, baby.
That sounded great. Let's make sure we save our session, and let's get ready to talk about mixing. Once everything's recorded, our next step is mixing. The most important topics here are balancing our track levels, panning, or placing our tracks in the sound field, the depth and dimension of our mix, and managing overall dynamics. Some of the more common tools we use in mixing are EQ, compression, reverb, and delay. Pro Tools provides a rich feature set for mixing and includes things like track grouping and extensive automation. Before we start mixing, this would be a good time to go to the playback engine and up the hardware buffer. That way we can access more real-time plugins. The mix window provides easy access to all of our channel levels. If we need to see more faders on the screen, we can choose Narrow Mix from the View menu. Let's look at some of our common mixing tools. In music, we use compression to manage dynamics. In other words, tame peaks in our tracks. When we do this, we can bring our overall track level up. Let's insert a DigiRack compressor on our drums track. DigiRack processors come with all Pro Tools systems. We can use the preset for drums as a starting point. When our signal hits the threshold, we begin to reduce its output by the ratio. The attack and release determine how fast the compressor reacts when a signal crosses the threshold and how long it waits to return to normal.
Once compression kicks in, the knee determines how fast we get to full compression. It's really important to listen. If we attack too fast, we'll compromise the transients that give the sound punch and character. Let's put another Digi-Rack compressor on the bass. Presets can provide a nice approach to attack and decay settings, but we'll definitely have to set up the threshold. We can use gain to boost the overall track level, or to make up for any reduction in level due to compression. Next, let's look at how we group tracks in Pro Tools. Our first step is to select all the tracks we want included in the group. Next, we choose New Group from the Mix Groups or Edit Groups menu. We'll name this Percussion. Grouping affects track levels, solos, mutes, editing functions, track display formats, and automation modes. Individual groups can be toggled on or off from the Mix Groups or Edit Groups area. Let's go ahead and add our keyboards to the mix. Let's make sure the Rhodes and organ are panned a little bit left and right. And we'll use EQ to roll off a little of the bottom end of the Rhodes track and give the bass a little more room in the mix. I'll insert a one-band EQ and set the type to high-pass filter. The basic function of a high-pass filter is to roll off frequencies below the cutoff frequency. I'll set this to about 170 Hz and give the bass a little more room in that range. EQ is used to boost or cut different frequency ranges. The basic EQ types are high pass. This allows frequencies higher than the filter frequency to pass unaffected and rolls off frequencies below. A low-pass filter does just the opposite. It rolls off high end. We can use the filter control to determine the shape. A low shelf is used to boost or cut frequencies below the shelf. Again, we have control of the shape and the frequency. A high shelf is used to boost or cut frequencies above the shelf. The peak setting is used to boost or cut frequencies around a center frequency. The Q determines the shape of the bell. Finally, a notch filter is used to eliminate unwanted frequencies. EQs vary in their options and degree of control, as well as in their sonic character. We'll go ahead and add our guitars and vocals and create groups for those too. Let's learn another mixing technique called solo safing. Ordinarily, when we solo a track, it soft mutes the other tracks. In the case of something like our vocals, we want to be able to solo a vocal track and still hear the reverb. We can achieve this by holding Control on the PC or Command on the Mac while we click on the solo button for the plate reverb. Now the reverb won't mute when other tracks are soloed. In other words, it's solo safe.
What I see in you.
Let's finish up our look at basic mixing by talking about Pro Tools automation. We have a lot of capabilities here, but let's see how easy it can be. Now we want to fade out at the end. So I'll click the Automation Mode selector on Master Fader 1 and change it to right.
Remember, we created two master faders when we created the session. One is assigned to our control room, or main mix. Master Fader 2 is controlling our headphone, or Q mix.
Now let's recall the marker we placed where we wanted our fade out to begin. Now we'll just start playback and record the master fader move. Now let's play it back. The mode switched to touch so we can touch up the automation, or we can just switch it to read. Read simply plays back the automation that's in the track. If we switch to the edit window, we can see the volume automation playlist assigned to the master fader. We can graphically edit automation data using the same tools we use to edit audio and MIDI. Let's turn things up just a notch. I'm going to insert the SansAmp plugin on the lead vocal and call up a preset. From the plugin window, I can click on Auto and choose which parameters I want to automate. I'll choose Master Bypass, and we can automate the bypass on the plugin as the track plays back. Since this is our first pass, let's set the automation mode to Right.
The hottest day of the summer, that's the day we met. I had a brand new electric car, you were driving an old Corvette. You ran the red light.
Now we went from basic to fairly advanced there, but I wanted you to see how powerful the mixer is and how easy it can be to use. Once we're satisfied with our mix, let's get ready to mix down our session to a stereo file. In order to increase the overall loudness of a file, it's common to use compression and limiting on the master fader. This can help produce a nice hot output comparable to commercial CDs. There's a lot of great plugins for compression and limiting. Let's begin by inserting Maxim on the master fader. Our first step in setting up Maxim is to link our controls. Next, we'll bring down the threshold until limiting occurs. We can use the bypass to take the plugin in and out and make sure we're comfortable with the sound of the limiter. Once we are, we'll unlink the controls and bring up the output. It's a good idea not to go all the way to 0. Let's hit the bypass one more time so we can hear the difference. Since we're creating a 16-bit file for audio CD, we'll want to turn on dither. Without getting too technical here, 16-bit audio can suffer from artifacts, especially at very low levels, like quiet passages or fade-outs. Dither and noise shaping can produce noticeable improvements in the sound of 16-bit audio. Now that we've applied limiting and dither, let's look at creating our final output file. To do this, we'll be using Pro Tools' Bounce to Disk feature. Bounce to Disk will create a new sound file that includes all of our audio, effects, and automation. If we have a selection made, Pro Tools will bounce the length of the selection. This is a good practice. We can make sure that our selection includes things like the final reverb tail. If we don't have a selection made, Pro Tools will just bounce to the length of the longest track. Next, we'll choose Bounce to Disk from the File menu. When we bounce, we choose the output source. Normally, this is our main stereo output. This works well since we can monitor our bounce to make sure there's no problems. We can choose different audio file types and formats. Since we'd like to send out an audio CD, we'll choose AIFF or WAV. If you want to create an MP3 file, you'll need the MP3 codec. Pro Tools comes with a 30-day trial license, but you can purchase a permanent license from DigiDesign's website. For CD audio, our file format needs to be stereo interleaved. We could use multi-mono if we wanted to import these files into this session or another session. We might do this to match EQ, sequence tracks, or compare relative levels of tracks on a CD project. Remember, CDs use 16-bit and 44.1, so we'll select those options now. Finally, let's choose Convert After Bounce. This lets Pro Tools complete the bounce before any file conversions occur. Next, we just click on Bounce, name our file, and select a destination for the bounce file. We'll create the bounce in our session folder, and we'll call it Good For You Demo. Now that our bounce is complete, we can create an audio CD with any standard software, like Windows Media Player, iTunes, or Toast. Once we've mixed our session and created any masters or pre-masters that we need, the next step is to back up our work. There's really two aspects to backup: backing up your work in progress during the project and archiving the project when it's complete. Now, a really simple strategy for daily backups is to keep a backup hard drive with a full copy of your working drive. You could also just burn a CD or DVD at the end of each day. The goal here is to have a separate physical copy of the data during the project. Once we're done with the project and we're ready to create a permanent archive, there's another consideration. In the process of creating a session, we can accumulate a lot of audio files, either through recording and importing, or through various edits and audio suite processes. If there's a lot of data that isn't needed beyond the production stage,
We can choose Select Unused from the Regions menu.
we can select all of our unused regions and even unused whole files if we like. We have the option to remove the unused regions from our session and remove whole files from our session or delete them from the hard drive. This option permanently deletes data from our hard drive, so we want to make sure we don't have any further use for this data in this session or any other session.
Pro Tools has a great feature called Save Copy In. This is accessed from the File menu, and it's great for archiving.
We can create a copy of our session in any format and copy all the data that's associated with it. For archiving, we want to make sure to check the option to copy all audio files. If we're moving our session to another studio, we might also want to copy the plugin settings. If our session includes video, there's an option for copying that data as well. Our final steps are naming the backup and deciding where to store it. Once our backup's complete, we can use any standard media burning software to create several permanent archives. Well, we've come a long way. We've recorded audio, MIDI, we've worked with loops, plugins, and mixing. You might be wondering what's over the horizon. The answer is a lot. There's sound for picture with integrated digital video, surround sound mixing, and specialized plugins for things like pitch correction, audio restoration, and modeling room acoustics. If you want to learn more, there are plenty of resources available. The most complete path to Pro Tools mastery is through DigiDesign's training and education program. You can visit the training page at digidesign.com for complete information. We hope you've enjoyed Pro Tools Method 1, and we hope you enjoy making music and creating sound with Pro Tools.